Wake the fuck up, Tumblr bitches. Where you at? You awake?
I really hope the microphone isn't picking up the crazy thunder that's happening right now. I mean, I already did my face up, so like, this video's happening. I'm not gonna record another day, so I'm sorry if there's ominous thunder throughout this video. I might not be able to record today. Oh my gosh. Hello everybody, welcome back to Monster Fest, or Monstober, where I attempt to make a video a week about My Babysitter's a Vampire. See, I don't even have to pay for the sound effects for this video. They're coming naturally to me. Last week we did a color and style analysis, and this week we're going to be doing a fandom discussion. So y'all ever notice how most people in the mbav fandom are, you know. So yes, for some reason that we're going to attempt to understand and explain today, a majority, if not all, of the people who are fans of My Babysitter's a Vampire are queer. So this isn't new or special to mbav. There are plenty of fandoms for quote-unquote normal shows that have nothing to do with the LGBTQ plus community, yet harbor a large queer fan base. I'm going to be using the terms queer and the LGBTQ plus community interchangeably. I hope no one minds that. This show is for the queer people. It's for the gays. And yeah, why is that? And why are there so many headcanons and fanon about characters within the show being queer themselves? These are all questions I want to look into. I have my note cards. I'm testing out different ways that I will feel comfortable with, like having a list of things to say while on camera. We're testing this out now. I also reached out to my two podcast hosts of the Vampy Wampy Campy podcast, where we reviewed every episode of My Babysitter's a Vampire, who are both queer themselves and are willing to give some insight, who have also experienced this sort of thing in different fandoms as well. Speaking of different fandoms, we've decided to relaunch the podcast now that we're done reviewing all of mbav, and we decided we're going to do the same thing but with Gravity Falls. And if I planned things right, the first episode where we talk about the pilot episode of Gravity Falls should be up on the official Vampy Wampy Campy podcast YouTube channel right now. Oh god, okay. Let's hope all that mess is behind us. So I guess one thing I should really clarify right out the gate is that, yes, the mbav fandom does still exist. The thing about a show that got cancelled prematurely and hasn't been on the air for over a decade and doesn't even have a legitimate way to stream it anymore is that people just assume that no one knows it exists. Which, fair enough, a lot of people don't, but just for clarification to make everybody's lives a whole lot easier, the whole series is available to watch in HD, in full, on YouTube. Check out Ethan's upload channel, which is a great resource for the whole series, along with the movie. So you do have a way to watch the film, even though technically, I don't know how legal that is, but let's just not say anything, okay? But yes, the mbav fandom does still exist, and it mainly exists on tumblr.com. Tumblr has had somewhat of a resurgence. It never really went away, per se, but I would say that the mbav fandom, at least in my eyes, has definitely increased in the past 4 or 5 years or so. There used to be a large fandom on Twitter, but I'm pretty sure, like, post-pandemic, that hasn't really been much of a thing anymore. Although if you're in the mbav fandom on Twitter, then please let me know. I think people post things on TikTok, but what I've been told by other fandom members who have TikTok, I don't. But what I've been told is that it's mainly just, like, pretty surface level stuff. Like, stuff you'd see for shows like Good Luck Charlie, you know? Like, there's no core fandom, really. But Tumblr's where it's at. Which makes a lot of sense because it is arguable that originally, as the show was airing, Tumblr was the original place that most people gathered for fandom discussion. However, there's a big elephant in the room that apparently no one else but me and a few other people can see, which is that the mbav Facebook group did 100% exist and was very active at the time. Technically, the mbav Facebook group was the main place that the people were supposed to gather in the fandom. It was moderated and ran by Fresh TV and Teletoon, the people who created My Babysitter's a Vampire. And writers and people who worked on the show would constantly be responding to fans' questions and posting stuff in the fan group page. So if you wanted a behind-the-scenes look at the show and questions answered as to, hey, where's the third season, then that is where everyone went. I'm probably going to expand on this more in my video next week, which will hopefully come out next week. It's a pretty big project that's been working on for a while now. But other than the Facebook group page, I would say Tumblr was the fandom's main squeeze. Genuinely, I can't express how happy I am that people have gone back and found and dug up these old posts, because what you slowly start to learn about the mbav fandom while the show was still airing is that it behaved pretty much exactly like many other Tumblr fandoms did at the time. It was essentially like the little kid brother of Super Hulock. It was like the children's table at Thanksgiving, because everything that happened in Super Hulock that people know about and mention these days also happened in the mbav fandom. The biggest fandom discourse at the time was, of course, the difference between the ships. It's always about the ships, isn't it? And that is where the queer fandom and queer codedness of the show comes into play. Obviously, people were shipping the two cishet white male leads together because this is 2012 after all.
And then another thing when it comes to headcanons, just like as food for thought, is like no one has ever really confirmed cishet either unless explicitly stated. So on a technicality, these characters being perceived as cishet is merely a headcanon too. Society at large kind of views queerness as still being something other than the default or normal or whatever. So seeing characters as queer is what's considered the headcanon, while being cishet is just assumed to be the case, even if it's something that isn't stated.
Beethan was this huge ship, and there was a lot of hate derived at Sarah because she was considered as a love interest for Ethan. Beethan is a perfectly fine ship, and there are a lot of elements of Beethan within the actual show. We'll talk about the legitimacy of them in a little bit. The main reason for this phenomenon is very vast and has been discussed quite often. A lot of times in these shows, the female characters aren't written as well as the male main leads are, and I'm not going to deny that that's not the case for My Babysitter's a Vampire. I think they had a lot of interesting ideas for Sarah, and they tried their best, but at a certain point, there just wasn't enough maybe female perspective to add more complexity to her, or they were focused on the male characters more, and her writing ended up getting pushed on the back burner. I fully mentioned this in my previous video. There's a whole arc of hers in season 1 that just gets discarded at the beginning of season 2, and then is maybe supposed to come back for season 3, but of course the show ends and they all die, so. But if you're a teenager and you decide to go on Tumblr and look up the mbav tag, which is what I did back in the day.
Back in 2012.
You're essentially mainly hit with Beethan stuff, with the occasional discourse about how Beethan is real and no, Ethera is real. My friend Anakin actually did find a block list of Ethera fans for the Beethan shippers. I forget how serious all this was back in the day. Nowadays in the mbav fandom, everyone ships everyone with each other. It's a common joke that the whole fan gang is just in a polycule. So there's no hate over well, if Ethan is with Sarah, then we can't also ship Beethan. None of it's real. The show's been over for over a decade now, and none of these are going to become canon anymore. The show's gone for forever. So it just kind of left this, existential, whatever, let's just do whatever we want kind of mentality to the culture, which I think is nice and refreshing. Just to touch on the hetero-ness for a little bit, just a little bit there, I think for a lot of people, Ethera, or Sarathan, whatever ship name you prefer, was probably seen as just as likely as Beethan, because at least early on in the show, Sarah and Ethan are such different characters on opposite spectrums of, willingness to date each other. Ethan seems to have this crush on Sarah that doesn't seem to be materializing in anything. She's a few years older than him, she's out of his league, and there doesn't really seem to be any reciprocation of that romantic interest on her part, even when they go on a date at the end of the show. Even though I've mentioned time and time again that as characters they have a lot of similarities, that was clearly not supposed to be obvious and present until way later in the show. But were they ever endgame? Who knows? My theory is no. There's too many complications, and maybe they just wouldn't have brought up the fact that she's immortal and he's just gonna get older. But because of that quirk, it's well, them just being gay and dating seem on the same level of hard to ride around. You know what I mean? Why were fandoms mainly comprised of teenage girls so obsessed with shipping cishet white men together? It's a question that people have been asking for a very long time now. As time goes on, it's been revealed that most of these teenage girls were either gay or trans. So in my unprofessional opinion, that is where I think this sort of influx of obsessing over gay ships and shows that have nothing to do with gayness at all comes into play.
I think with a lot of TV shows, oftentimes their fandom tends to grow just a little collection of queer people, over time. That's just kind of I think just a normal thing that's going to happen eventually. With mbav, I think it's a special case just because it's a show that a lot of people watched in their childhood. Or like people will watch media that's made for children just to kind of reconnect to a childhood they didn't get to have. And I noticed, well, at least personally, that this tends to happen a lot with queer people, or like neurodivergent people who had to grow up too quickly. Situations with like people who had just traumatic childhood. So I think that's also another part of it, just because a lot of, especially like queer people, especially nowadays, tend to want to reconnect to their childhood. To be quite honest, I didn't see a whole lot of representation in the show itself, just because being queer was still considered like kind of taboo at the time. It's really more a lot of the fandom that I really saw representation in, just because so many people kind of interpret the character in their own ways.
It's this idea of representation, and this idea of misconstruing on purpose, not because you're misguided or don't understand social cues, a purposeful misinterpretation of what the actual text is for your own personal gain, of the kind of joke queer elements of the show becoming real. That seems to be a more realistic representation than the very obvious and very kind of sanitized and annoying version of representation that a lot of companies do nowadays. No offense to Love, Simon, but like that's a gay movie made for straight people. That's for grandma to watch. That's grandma's gay movie, you know? Versus the queerness and the subtext within mbav is a lot more juicy and complicated.
So I guess when it comes to like my own identity and elements of representation I see, of course there's just like the general queerness of everything. I myself like to headcanon characters as Ariel or Ace, just because that's what I am. Ethan is my main victim, and like, I don't know, he's just like so like bi Ace to me. But also it could just be kind of projecting. I do see some of myself in characters like Ethan or Rory, but it's more due to personality or other things, like Ethan dealing with panic attacks towards the finale. But I know a lot of other people do see more parts of their queer identity or headcanon it in these characters as well.
There are many jokes in mbav where Benny and Ethan are shown as having queer subtext, and it's played for laughs as a punching down sort of joke. Like, haha, they're role-playing asking each other out on a date, and Ross is confused by it, but, you know, he doesn't want to judge his teenage son. It makes me think, why was this so common in shows like Sherlock? I also think there's this sort of element of kind of trying to read the room, maybe, but also say, like, hashtag no homo. When I think of Moffat sitting down and being like, we're gonna write a modern interpretation of Sherlock, one of the things someone mentions is, like, you know, people think that they're gay? That Sherlock and Watson are gay? And he's like, right, we need to acknowledge that because people think gay people are fine now, which is back in the day, like, it was not even talked about. People think gay people are cool now. So we have to, like, mention the fact that, like, yes, these two characters could be gay, but they're not in this show. And that arrives in jokes that are making fun of queer-codedness and making them queer-coded, but then going hashtag no homo about it. So, like, for example, Benny and Ethan becoming Betty and Veronica, which, yes, is a very funny Archie Comics joke. That is seen as a more complex and interesting representation of transness than something that's very sanitized and easy to consume. Corporate media are mainly making these projects not out of a necessity of wanting to represent people and wanting to tell diverse stories, but of getting money from those diverse crowds. It's kind of a common joke among the mbav fandom nowadays that, like, we reclaim the 3 Cheers for Evil episode.
Oftentimes a lot of older shows like this didn't really have characters to portray in that way in a positive light, especially, like, I noticed a lot of times with trans characters, especially trans women, they were seen as like the quote-unquote drag queens or like the weirdos or even just like like trans people in general are often seen as like the weirdos. Same with the queer people or just like cis queer people. They were often seen as like the butt of a joke, or like they were the outcasts, or like the nerds, or like people who were bullied very often weren't really the main characters. They're often portrayed as like the kooky side character that no one wants to really talk to, or like they're annoyed at being talked to by them. And so of course people like they want to see themselves in that show, in that media, in that music, in that book, things like that. Things like that.
One thing I will say is that headcanoning Benny Weir as actually a trans person does make him seem a lot more interesting and fully realized. Like, there are a lot of weird quirks throughout the show that are just mean and nasty and are intentionally supposed to make the character a little bit of a weirdo, actually make the character more interesting and explains a lot of those things as being, you know, complex emotions being played out. Same goes for Beethan. Like, a lot of the weird ways that Benny acts around women can just be explained as him overcompensating, trying to overemphasize his attraction to women, when in reality, he wants to date Ethan. That joke where Grandma Weir is like, Sarah is the person you care the most about, Ethan, and Benny's like, but I'm his best friend, and how they've essentially created a friendship is magic throuple at the end of the show. So, like, why do people headcanon Ethan as trans so much? He is specifically portrayed as this scrawny, smaller, nerdy, less masculine person on the show, and yet he is still a hero. He is still important and well valued among all the members. So because of that, championing him as some sort of trans representation can feel very validating for a lot of people. And again, because the fandom is so old and the show has been off air for so many years, no one actually wants this to become real within the canon because there is no more canon to be made real. It's just general fan discussion and fan works being created with this idea in mind.
And I think a lot of times people in fandom will do this just because they want to feel a lot closer to the media they enjoy or like the characters they really like. I tend to do this myself also, especially, for example, like with trans Ethan Morgan. Like, a lot of people growing up who did not identify as men at the time, like, I noticed, tend to grow up and really identify with Ethan Morgan just because, especially with like a lot of the nerdy tropes, they're seen as like inferior or like weak, or like not manly because they're nerds. And so that really kind of like in my head connects with a lot of like the trans experience, because of course growing up with that feminine identity, it really feels like you have to live up to being manly, even though a lot of the time you are like considered feminine. A lot of people will tend to do this just because they want to feel closer to the media they're watching, or like see themselves in a character that they really like.
To talk more about Serica, that's where I really think this sort of fan creation has blossomed the most. I would argue it's the ship that has benefited the most from collective creation. Like, in the actual canon of the show, Erica's a horrible friend to Sarah. I've called this out multiple times already. She's kind of supposed to be a bad person. She's a complex character, okay? I don't mind when she kills people. But see, the thing is, since there's so much implied history between the two characters, that means there is a whole lot of stuff to discover outside of the actual show. And on purpose, because I don't know if I really want the show to delve more into the relationship between the two. I want it to improve. I want them to not get in a fight in literally every episode. But I also don't think they need to, like, have a full-on gay relationship arc. So I think Serica is really where this fan creation element is most important to me. It's an element of the show that, like, necessarily doesn't need to actually be present within it, but is something that I 100% love to see created by fans. So there's this constant dynamic between both fully realizing characters and trying to make them more 3D by making them queer or having some sort of secret element that they're not explaining to everybody else. But then there's also an element of flattening characters. I seem to see this a lot with the gender divide. So like male characters being headcanoned as queer or members of the LGBTQ plus community make them more fully realized in 3D, versus female characters being headcanoned as gay makes them flattened. It flattens them. It makes them stereotypes. This is two different kinds of conversations happening on Tumblr around the time. There's this famous post that's like, whenever a character has a certain archetype, they immediately assign the stereotype associated with a queer identity. Now, I don't necessarily agree with this, I'm just bringing it up as a point that I've seen on the internet. How automatically associating a character with a queer identity can flatten their identity. It's definitely a lot less of a common discussion than the whole-roundedness approach that we've talked about. while I can see this being an element of the mbav fandom that people do, I would love to have a conversation in the comments below about maybe the reason why, or even if it's that prevalent within the mbav fandom, because I think it can be said both ways. I don't want to outright say that it doesn't happen at all among mbav fans, but I don't think it is as prevalent as it is in other fandoms, although I don't have much education on other fandoms. So yes, I would love to hear people's opinions in the comments below. Please let me know what you think about this topic. If I'm, putting too much emphasis on it, then I apologize. I just wasn't sure how much I should mention on this specific element of queer headcanoning.
When it comes to headcanons, I personally love it. It's something I actively do with any fictional media I fall in love with, and to me, it adds something more to these characters. I like being able to take them into my hands and put a little bit of myself or the people I know into them, or just random things I find fun or interesting. Perhaps there could be negatives in general if there's extreme negative stereotyping that happens with these headcanons. And then of course, for whatever reason, there's always been discourse around having headcanons about characters being trans or queer, and then that being brought up to showrunners and actors. And then also just interpersonal fandom drama, petty fandom drama. In general, I don't see much negative about headcanon characters as LGBT as a concept. I think it's a fun fandom thing to do. It's hard to say why people fandom and do this, because everyone kind of has their own reasons. From anything where it's just a fun activity to partake in, while others maybe want to project it. I mean this positively, but project their identities onto their faves. It could come from a desire to have more characters like them on screen. Like I said earlier, I myself like to headcanon characters as aro ace or generally queer, because it's something that I am, and I think it would be neat to have characters I know and love be as such. Plus, on the fun side, it could be fun to draw from life experiences, give those to these characters, and just do all that, given that they're so moldable. And the mbav characters are just so moldable. They fill certain archetypes, and that leaves a lot open for interpretation, and for the fandom to kind of take these characters into their grubby little hands and make them their own.
And with anything being negative, I don't think there's really anything negative with the headcanons themselves, just because a lot of the fandom itself is queer, so there's not really a lot of bigotry going on with that. When I say bigotry, not as much I hate the gays kind of thing. It's more just with the toxicity in shipping. I've seen it a few times with Ethan. I notice it tends to happen in toxic spaces with male ships. Of course, Ethan and Sarah, it's the close to canon ship that a lot of people, of course, are going to ship just because it's the closest to being canon. But oftentimes with Beethan, not oftentimes, sometimes with Beethan shippers, the really toxic ones, they tend to kind of push Sarah out of the picture just because she's quote unquote in the way of the male relationship. And this isn't just something I've seen with Beethan. A lot of people saw Lawrence, the ship that was with Lance from Voltron, they saw her in the way of Clance. Now that I think about it, there's not really any other ones I've seen besides Clance that I actually wrote down. But it's a thing that I've noticed happens really often in fandom. It's mainly with the shipping aspect. There's not really any negatives with the headcanons of being trans and queer themselves.
The supernatural element, I think, is also a thing that affects a lot of this. mbav is a coming-of-age story. All of these characters are reaching their maturity in that influx period where they start to become grown-ups, and they're learning brand new things about each other that they didn't know existed, and they're not really comfortable with fully. Let's go! The children's show gay allegory continues! It's just like High School Musical all over again. If I reach 1,000 subscribers, I'll definitely make a video about High School Musical, I promise. So there's a sort of transgressiveness about vampirism, about being a seer, about being a spellmaster, about learning this new part of your identity that is completely different from everyone you're surrounded by. So I think that accidental allegory, and I'm going to say accidental on purpose because there's no way the people who created this show thought of that on purpose, unless there was maybe some woke king in the writer's room. This accidental allegory speaks to a lot of people, and that comes out in their fanon and fan creation, art, fanfic, and and other works, which I find to be very, very beautiful. Nothing sparks joy more in my life than seeing some new mbav art or fanfic or discussion, because since the show is pretty hard to find in the modern day, I feel like the fans' passion for the project is what keeps it alive. Kind of like Candyman. You know, you can't forget about it, because if you do, that's when the power goes away.
I think part of it is the inherently queer nature of vampires, movie monsters, and just horror in general. Especially when it comes to monsters, there's always a factor of othering that occurs that a lot of queer people find relatability in. These creatures aren't typically perceived as normal, and they can be ostracized because of it. In the case of vampires, it could be something intrinsic or in their nature, like their weakness to the sun, that makes it hard to exist among the general population. Or it could be someone discovering their true nature and turning away from them because of this perception of being a monstrosity. While it's not pleasant to live through, many find that they relate to this aspect. There's also a factor of vampires having a certain gothic or just generally alternative quality to them, which are subcultures that have often been a refuge for queer people, with a large part of what they stand for being acceptance for marginalized groups. Even old vampire examples like Carmilla are just very queer stories.
Another thing, especially with Monster High being a new thing recently, a lot of queer people tend to really not really horror, but just the monster, kooky, monster, campy kind of thing. I think we've discussed this before, but in a lot of supernatural tropes tend to have some queer subtext, especially with vampires and things like that. Werewolves is another one. They tend to have a lot of queer subtext, where a lot of supernatural creatures tend to be the outcast, or the quote-unquote other, that a lot of people are afraid of, or tend to, well, I think discriminate's a strong word, but discriminate against. And I think that's part of a couple of reasons why mbav and their whole fandom just in general tends to be a little bit more queer-coded in that way.
Anyways, I'm not the most qualified person to talk about this, which is why I called in my friends for some help. And I really wanted this video to spark up a conversation and discussion about this, specifically relating to mbav, but also to online fandom as a whole. So please feel free to comment below what your personal opinions are. If I said something wrong or, offended anybody, please let me know. I want to make sure, I get called out. So I don't just keep doing it, Just be nice to me, please, okay? Don't send me death threats. Buy the merch, subscribe, like the video. Last week I made a mbav video. Next week on Halloween Day, hopefully, I'm going to be making a mbav video. There is so much misinformation about My Babysitter's a Vampire out there. It's kind of insane, actually. My next video is going to be sort of clearing up all of the misconceptions and misconstrued elements of the show's history, because to understand the history of mbav is to understand why it got canceled inevitably. So anyways, thank you for watching. Check out the new podcast episode. That's really exciting. Go to comicbookddr.shopify.com if you want to check out some really cool handmade buttons and bracelets. Everything is under $5 right now, and I'm currently holding a Halloween sale where everything that is mbav related at my merch store is 25% off. There's also exclusive merch that will only be available for this month, so go check it out. And I'll talk to all of you guys later. Bye.
So